Hello and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host, and this is episode 146. Now, it should come as a little surprise to most of you that the study of the Christianization of societies in late antiquity has a strong Christian bias in modern historiography. After all, the field of study itself began in Christian societies, was advanced by Christian scholars who saw a kind of teleological plan unfolding here that led to the creation of Christian societies. And even in a post-Christian, sort of secular scholarly context, many of these assumptions continue to live on, if they're not linked to modern national ideologies too. In many countries, the dominant religion, or whatever version of Christianity it is baked into the very national identity itself. Now, I'm not referring here merely to a kind of bias in favor of, say, Christian figures or Christian ideals or ideas or theologies, but rather to some more fundamental components of the structure of research itself. For example, for a very long time, there was an ingrained assumption that Christianity prevailed in part because previous ancient religions were already dying or decayed or hollow or superficial or just simply could not address the real religious needs that people feel. This has been largely discredited and has been for some time, but it's just one of those assumptions that was driving research for a very long time. Another example is that the process is understood not only teleologically, but linearly. In other words, just a growing advancement of Christianity with no backtracking. In the current study of late antiquity, there's also a heavy bias in favor of essentializing Christianity and, quote, accidentalizing any sort of, quote, pagan attributes that someone might have. What do I mean by that? So if in any given context, a particular figure or, let's say, event or development, but it's mostly a figure such as an author, gives mixed signals, any association with Christianity is taken to be primary, a sort of essence of that person in terms of identity, and the signs of engagement with classical culture or ancient religion are taken to be a kind of cultural preoccupation that even Christians can engage in sometimes. Almost never the reverse. Again, because the direction, the flow of history is understood to go in one direction when we're studying this question. This creates a great deal of confusion when we're faced with characters, for example, such as Constantine the Great, who seems to give off some mixed signals. This has resulted in a wide range of interpretations and a lot of hand-wringing over what's going on. For quite some time, we've been convinced that Constantine was essentially a Christian, which then means that we have to find some other language, and preferably non-religious in the way that we understand religion, to explain all of the other signals that he's giving off. And again, in line with our linear thinking when it comes to such questions, we try to put all of those data points into a narrative that is a story of increasing Christianization, engagement with the church and with Christian religious matters on the part of that emperor, hopefully pointing toward a more, quote, authentic or sincere or profound embrace of his new faith. Now, we face these problems in the case of Constantine, who is a very well-documented figure for his time. Obviously, we would like to have a lot more, especially sort of contemporary sources, but one of my professors once told me that even if we had Constantine's diary, we couldn't entirely trust it. Okay, so what do we do in the case of kings and kingdoms or realms that converted around the time of Constantine, and there were quite a few, for which we have very, very little evidence? And I'm thinking here in particular of cases such as Armenia or Georgia, or Iberia in the Caucasus, and also the great African kingdom of Aksum, which lay in the geographical region of two modern countries, Ethiopia and Eritrea. In the case of these contemporary kingdoms, we are largely at the mercy of very brief narratives about traveling saints or holy figures who end up in those regions, and to make some complicated stories short, have a series of encounters that result in the conversion of the local king. And these stories are reported mostly in church historians in the Roman Empire, or much later local authors. And personally, I find these stories very difficult to believe. So today we're going to be talking about one of those kingdoms, the kingdom of Aksum, and its 4th century king Ezana, who is held to have converted to Christianity. And we're going to be looking not so much at the narrative that is told about the conversion of Aksum by the church historian Rufinus of Aquileia. This is a author writing in Latin in the Roman Empire around the year 400, so a few generations after Ezana. If that's the king his story intends, it's not entirely clear. We will talk about Aksum in the episode itself, but in case you don't know it very well, this was a major state in East Africa, and as late antiquity wore on, it became more and more important and eventually a major player in the international conflicts and alliances, especially in the later 5th, 6th centuries and into the 7th century as well. My guest today is Aaron Butz of the University of Hamburg in Germany. And his first book was called Language Change in the Wake of Empire, and it was about Syriac in its Greco-Roman context. This was a very interesting book because it crossed disciplinary boundaries in a fascinating way. The Syriac is what we call the late antique version of Aramaic used by church writers, but it is in fact a version of Aramaic. And Aramaic had been in contact with Greek and other languages, but especially Greek, for many centuries by that point, and had been influenced by it, presumably vice versa, for a very long time before it became a Christian literary language. Aaron has impressive linguistic credentials when it comes to studying this Eastern Mediterranean world broadly, from North Africa, Syria, and the Caucasus. And he has recently authored a fascinating study of Ezana of Aksum, which breaks with the linear teleological way in which Christianization is typically studied. And it is based not so much on the quasi-romantic stories told by Rufinus of Aquileia, but rather the material and epigraphic and numismatic evidence from Aksum itself, which is certainly the best way to begin to study Ezana, which is from his own monuments, statements, proclamations, symbols, and so forth. And there's a question of how do we order them, both in time and in terms of the social groups to which they are addressed, because they're in sometimes different languages too. Before we dive into Ezana himself, we spend some time talking a little bit about the context of this kind of research and in this part of the world. Okay, so I will stop there. Here's my conversation with Aaron, and thanks also to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell us first a little bit about your areas of primary research. What ancient languages do you work on mostly in the original?
Yeah, so I'm a specialist of I would say, the Eastern Mediterranean, and working mainly on Christians, but also on Jews and Muslims to some degree, and really focusing primarily on Syriac Christians a bit further north, and then down into the Horn of Africa with Ethiopian Christians. Yeah.
Okay. So since you mentioned Ethiopian Christians, in sort of late antiquity, there is a major state in that area that we call Aksum. Can you tell us why this was important to the world of late antiquity? And in particular, like, what kind of languages were spoken there? What were the main forms of worship? And just kind of broadly speaking today, like, how do we relate the concepts of Aksum and Ethiopia?
Yeah, certainly. Complex questions. So I'm probably best to just start with something concrete. That is the city of Aksum, which is in the north part of what is now the country of Ethiopia. And this was first and foremost a city. We don't know how early, but already, say, in late antiquity, a thriving city. And it's also seems to be the term for an eponymous empire. So you have a city with an empire based around it. So you have, for instance, lots of coins that will talk about a king of Aksum, referring to this general region. It seems to have been quite an important city in late antiquity. And it's kind of hard to bear in mind, but I think a good example is that the Kephaliah of Mani, it lists 4 great kingdoms, and one of them is the Aksumites. So the Romans, the Babylonians and Persians, the Chinese, and the Aksumites. So it's a bit surprising to me, even as a specialist, but like looking back to this, late antique period, it's listed as one of the 4 great kingdoms. Part of this is no doubt because they controlled a port on the Red Sea, Adulis. So this was a major port of trade and controlled this port and major kind of shipping lanes for a lot of places in late antiquity around the Red Sea. So this is where the Aksumite Empire derived its wealth and, to a large extent, its prestige, controlling the waters on the Red Sea. You also asked about language and forms of... Yeah, please.
Yeah, what's the linguistic and religious situation in this region?
Yeah, so both are a bit hard to get at, I think, but so we can try. This is, I think, one of the things that I like most in my work, that we're working with very little data. So language is what was, say, spoken in the Kingdom of Aksum. This we can only guess at to some degree. So it must have been various Cushitic languages, various Semitic languages. What we have, of course, are written formal languages. So we have coins and inscriptions from Aksum and the surrounding area in Greek language, which is quite interesting, and I think it'll be kind of a recurring theme throughout the podcast. But why would rulers of Aksum mainly, at least in their coins, choose to write in Greek as opposed to any local language? So we have Greek. We also have inscriptions in Old South Arabian. So this would be the language and scripts that are not primarily associated with the Horn of Africa, but just jump across the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula. So we have some inscriptions from Aksum in Old South Arabian script and also in Old South Arabian language. And then we have another Semitic language, which would be classical Ethiopic, or Ge'ez, in which we have inscriptions and also some coins. So these are kind of the main written languages that we would have from the area in various configurations, multilingual, multi-script, and really interesting questions, I think, about what language kind of what these rulers are trying to show by using different languages for different audiences.
You mentioned Mani, who ranked Aksum as one of the 4 major kingdoms, and I just want to say, for my part, when I was writing the history of the East Roman state during these centuries, I observed a process of a greater and greater, how should I put it, multipolarity in this world, where you start with this 2 superpower situation, Rome and Parthia, Rome and Persia, but gradually you start to get more and more major powers that they're having to contend with. And there's Himyar in Arabia, there's definitely Aksum, and then of course in the north, depending on the period, but Avars and whatever. And it's just a completely different geostrategic situation, and much more, there's so many more poles of power. And Aksum really seems to be a powerhouse in the south, spanning the Red Sea, sometimes extending its power right into Arabia. And then this grows over time. Like you don't start out that way in the 4th century. We'll be talking about the 4th century. It's kind of like on the horizon, but the foundations for that kind of power is there. So what kind of connections did Aksum have with the Roman empires, or very broadly in this period?
With the Roman Empire, yes. So, we're thinking about, first, I think it's interesting to think about these, the use of Greek and Greek inscriptions, Greek coins. So I think that we can say that Aksumite rulers are projecting themselves as some way connected to the Roman Empire. It's an interesting question, but they seem to want to be a part of the Roman Empire, or at least in this kind of sphere of influence, sphere of power. I think there's various kind of data points you can think about. Another one is that you just mentioned this, the great superpower battle between the Eastern Roman Empire and Sasania, Persia. And here, of course, Aksum finds itself playing a role depending on which scholarly analysis you go with. But I'm thinking of Caleb, and this a bit later than we'll be talking about today. But Caleb, an Aksumite king in the 6th century, crossed over the Red Sea to defend Christians in the city of Najran. And again, depending on exactly how one interprets this, but I mean, one of the I'm thinking of Glenn Bowersock's book, but one of the ways that this has been read by scholars is this is, a proxy war with the Aksumite king fighting on behalf of the Eastern Roman Empire against Jews in Najran who would be allied with the Persian Empire. It's not the only way to read it. I'm actually working on a paper with colleague Simca Gross, kind of rethinking this. But I think it gives a sense of the role that Aksum plays in these kind of larger world struggles at the time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think these connections are very important for anyone who wants to get their head outside the Roman Empire. And a lot of research takes place entirely within it. But there comes a point when you start to have these kinds of continent-spanning alliances that just kind of remind you of like World War I or just something weird like that, right? Where like the Persians are allied with the Avars who are to the north of the Danube, and the Romans are allied with the Turks who are to the north of the Persians, and the Turks and the Avars hate each other going way back. And you have these proxy wars going on in the south too with Himyar and Aksum and all of that.
Yeah. If I can, I think it's really interesting. I think that absolutely these proxy wars are interesting. I think from my own perspective, I really like to push the kind of the local sources. So it's interesting that you have Aksumite kings in the Arabian Peninsula already much earlier. So even before Ezana, so even in the 3rd century, we have inscriptions talking about a king, a Nagasi of Aksum, who's active in the Arabian Peninsula. And I think we really have to see, we have centuries of power struggles between Aksum and the Arabian Peninsula. And it's, of course, the most immediate context. So even Ezana, who we'll come to, he styles himself not only as the king of Aksum, but the king of Himyar, which we're quite sure historically his kingdom never reached, right? But it's part of the imagination. And he's playing on these kind of earlier images of Aksumite kings across the Arabian Peninsula. So yeah, it's
like the Queen of England, who was also the Queen of France until fairly recently.
Exactly. Yeah. So
yeah. Okay, so tell us about the stelae in Aksum. You describe them a little bit. What are these, and why do you start your study of Ezana with them?
Yeah. So we have these stelae that are they're basically large stones all across the Horn of Africa, especially in the northern part of the Aksumite kingdom. They're basically funerary. And in Aksum itself, we have a funerary field where there's 6 or so relatively large ones that are basically funerary monuments for Aksumite kings. And they're of quite different sizes. So we have as small as like 1.5 meters up to one that seems to be about 30 meters long. And it's been estimated that it was 520 tons. One scholar said that it's the largest stone that was ever attempted to be raised in antiquity. And and the question is, it doesn't look like it was ever raised. So it's why it's fallen in the field today. So I start with them for 2 reasons. One is a methodological reason so we have these funerary stelae. They are probably over tombs. We have some tombs in the area, so this seems quite clear. But the methodological reason we have them, we have some idea of what they are. We have no idea to whom each of them belongs. So we have, and this I think gets at the kind of data we're working with in this field that we just don't know. So they kind of increase in size. The assumption is that this is probably each king building something bigger than the previous. You can think of, Egyptians and their pyramids or however you want to think about it. And then we get to this last great one that was, doesn't seem like it was ever erected. And the assumption that scholars make, and I'm among them, is that this last one marked the end of the pre-Christian period and the beginning of the Christian period. That with Christianity, we no longer had this traditional funerary stela, and so it marks this transition in a way. But we don't know whose it is. So that's my methodological point, that we have no idea who it is. So it's probably Ezana or the king who came before Ezana. But this is the kind of I'll use this phrase a lot in the podcast, but this is the house of cards upon which we as scholars are working, that these are the kinds of assumptions that one's working with this type of data. So it's really a methodological question of what do you do with this type of really fragmented evidence. The second reason I use, so you have this methodological point. The second reason is because it's just like, if you see this stela that's fallen, it's so evocative of the changes that would take place with the Aksumite kingdom switching from pre-Christian, non-Christian to Christian. But it's, of course, all in retrospect. That is, in Ezana's time, we have no idea that any of this is going to happen, which is, a big part of the kind of the research that I'm conducting now, is this fluidity on the ground. So I like it to, looking back, it's quite evocative to see this change, this great stela that was never erected, and then they cease being erected. But this is all just an image in retrospect. So I think it helps kind of have some tension that it's a quite clear symbol, but nothing's clear on the ground at the time.
And they're very impressive monuments. I encourage the audience to look them up. I mean, it's easy to find images of them online. They're very distinctive style too. I can totally imagine a story where whoever this king was said, "Make me the biggest one yet." And they do. And then he says, "Okay, now erect it." And they're like,
It's absolutely amazing standing next to it. I mean, standing in the field and like standing next to it. It's as tall as I am. And it's just massive. I mean, estimated over 500 tons of stone. And it's just unbelievable. It's really huge.
So, what do we know about Ezana? Why has he become so important in the scholarship?
Ezana is, I would say, I already mentioned Caleb. He's the other Aksumite king that people would have heard about or known about, and that we have, fairly decent, relatively speaking, sources for. So Ezana is important because we have lots of sources for him, relatively speaking, and in his reign, we start seeing Christianity in the Horn of Africa for the first time. So we have coins of Ezana that are quite, evocative, big gold coins that have a disc and crescent, and they say Ezana, king of Aksum. And then right alongside it in a hoard of coins, you'll find Ezana, king of Aksum, with a Christian cross on it. So just the imagery of seeing a gold coin with a cross on it for the first time in the Horn of Africa, of course, is quite amazing. And then we also have inscriptions, about half a dozen, maybe a little bit more, inscriptions of Ezana. These are mainly inscriptions that repeat his military conquests. I, Ezana, king of Aksum, and all of these other places I went and conquered, and this is the type of thing that I did. And then we have yet another source that's interesting, that in Athanasius's Apology to Constantius, we get a Greek text reported that is a letter from Constantius to Ezana and one Cesanes, who are the tyrants, the kings of Aksum. So we have this external mention of Ezana, and he's addressed as the king of Aksum, and also there's mention of one Frumentius, who is a bishop in Aksum. So you get this kind of external collaboration, not only of Ezana and of one Cesanes, who we actually know from his inscriptions to be a brother of Ezana, but also of Christianity and also of a bishop Frumentius. So we have this, I mean, I know for people working in other areas of the Byzantine world, these would seem like very sparse sources. But for those of us specializing in Ethiopian and Eritrean studies, this is a wealth of data that we basically have for no one else. Coins, inscriptions, and an external, more or less contemporaneous Greek text of, 20 lines mentioning him. So it's, the sources are rich for Ezana, relatively speaking. And we have Christianity for the first time.
Right. So this is very likely the first Christian monarch in Africa, or at least at a time when that kingdom was beginning to convert, in quotation marks or not, at that time. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of the broader context of other kings who were sort of going Christian, or at least making Christian gestures at this time, just so that our audience knows that, I mean, he's not alone in this period.
Right. Yeah. No, not at all, of course. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the most well known, I think, would probably be Constantine with his famous vision in 312. So we have Constantine, who's a bit before Ezana, but, I mean, I think we'll probably come back to him throughout the podcast, but seems to be doing, well, Ezana is probably doing similar things, at least that's what I would argue, to what Constantine's doing. Adopting Christian imagery and language in ways that are of use to him. But these two aren't the only ones, so I think we'll come to Rufinus eventually as well. But Rufinus also tells us a story about the Iberian kingdom converting, along with a story that many people read as about Aksum. So also the Caucasus, somewhere you have kind of royal conversion around the same time, it seems like. And I think it's also important, I think, especially for this audience and for this body of information, to maybe not only about Christianity, but if we jump across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula, this is also the same time that we have so-called monotheistic language popping up in inscriptions from Himyar. So some of these are scholars call them vaguely or indeterminately monotheistic, Lord of heaven, Lord of all. Some of them seem to be more specifically Jewish, and there's a debate about exactly what's kind of going on with these. But this type of material is happening exactly at the same time, just across the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula, and we will find very similar language with Ezana. So it's not only Christianity that's in play with, say the Caucasus and Constantine, but also monotheism writ large and kind of complicated at the moment, say maybe theoretically underdefined terms, but just across the Red Sea. So there's a lot of kind of data points to kind of triangulate here.
Yeah, we'd done a previous episode on Himyar and the kind of language used there, which is described in such interesting ways as, was it generic Judaism was one of them?
Yeah, generic Judaism, undifferentiated monotheism. Yeah, I mean, yeah. But they are, I mean, they're really interesting texts. Like I said, Ezana has some that, I mean, we will come to them, but Lord of all, Lord of heaven, Lord of earth. And what does this mean?
I would add the Goths in the Danube region, right? They don't have like one king, so it's kind of less spectacularly royal in that way. But we know that a lot of Gothic leaders at the time are also converting to Christianity. So there's this arc from the Danube down to Africa that seems to be making these very bold experiments at this time. So why don't we start with Rufinus's story about the conversion of Ethiopia? So in brief, what's the story and what are the problems with it? And there are a lot of problems with it, but yeah.
Yeah. So this is a interesting text. Yeah. So I just can tell the story just briefly to start with. So it goes something like this. We have a merchant, Meropius. He's traveling on a boat. He parks outside in a port, and he goes on land, and he brings two young boys who are kind of in his party. They get attacked by locals. The locals kill everyone in this party of Meropius, except these two young boys, one of whom is named Frumentius, and one of whom is named Odysseus. So this warring party kills everybody, and they take these two young boys to the local king and give them as kind of a tribute, as a gift. The king takes these two boys, installs them in leadership positions in his kingdom. Why, we don't know. And then the king suddenly dies. So these two young boys, Frumentius and Odysseus, are with the king's son, who is too young to really rule, but the implication of the text is they kind of help this young boy king along the way. When the young boy king gets old enough, Odysseus goes home to Tyre, and Frumentius, where does he go? He goes to Alexandria, and he is ordained as the first bishop of this land by none other than Athanasius the Great. And the implication of the text is that along the way, this Frumentius is supporting Christianity.
Mhm.
So this is kind of the kernel of the story that occurs first in Rufinus, but then is found in a number of other Greco-Roman church historians, and then it's also found in the Ethiopic tradition. Interestingly, ultimately, though, from the
Yeah,
Greco-Roman sources.
from
Yeah,
Rufinus, who was writing originally in Latin,
exactly.
right, but whose stories were translated into Greek very quickly. And
Right, right. And it's the Greek version that kind of forms
yeah,
the kernel, it seems, of what's
yeah.
going on in the Ethiopic text. So this story, this is the kernel of the story. And it's always been taken by scholars to be related to the conversion of Aksum with the child king converting, and this child king being our Ezana. So
Right.
the problems are manifold, as you said, and I mean, we could spend 4 hours on them, but just some short problems. One, Ezana is not named. So there's nothing that says anything about Ezana. There's nothing about the story even being about Aksum. Aksum's also not mentioned. The story is about India vaguely, and India could be Aksum in this time period. But it's quite interesting that that Rufinus has a quite specific geography before this story, and even talks about Ethiopia, and that the lot for Ethiopia fell to Matthew. And but it's quite unclear. I mean, I can quote the most recent translator of the Latin text. He says it's quite unclear that Rufinus has what Rufinus has in mind at all for the geography of this story. Those scholars have always taken it to be about, maybe always is too strong, but take it to be about Aksum, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
There's also chronological problems that the details have to do with the apology that I mentioned earlier, that the dates there don't square with what Rufinus says. There's about a 30-year discrepancy as to when this would all be taking place. Not impossible. But for me, I mean, so there's lots of problems. These have been known for, I mean, almost 150 years. People have been kind of trying to solve these problems. For me, though, I mean, what my research, what I was really interested in, is it's really difficult to square Rufinus's story with the actual Aksumite sources. I mean, first and foremost, Rufinus doesn't talk about the king of, doesn't name the king by name, or even say that he converted to Christianity. But even more, how do we reconcile the actual Aksumite sources, coins, inscriptions? What is going on in this historical narrative? And
Mm-hmm.
this is, for me, kind of one of the main cruxes of my argument, that this is really difficult to do, and I mean, I don't think we should do it, basically. So it's
Yeah. Added to which is the whole sort of romantic, folkloric kind of quality of the story. It's one of those moments where you can tell in the text that you're transitioning from like what these historians regard as rigorous history, recounting accounts, and suddenly things become extremely vague. There's the child, there's the bandits, there's the king. It's all just so timeless and right, it could be anywhere, anyone. And it's equally problematic in the case of the stories told about Armenia and Georgia and Bulgaria later on, and to a certain degree, even Rus. Just quite frankly, I don't believe any of these narratives. Like, if I were to tell the story, like, if anyone asked me about the conversion of these lands, I don't think I would even mention these stories. Whatever, for the same reasons. They're just kind of so generic. Anyway, there are
yeah,
clearly very complex processes going on the ground that are completely occluded from any of this.
yeah.
Um, anyway, the so let's look at the Ethiopic evidence or the local evidence that you mentioned because well, I was about to say it tells a different story, but it doesn't really. It's been made to tell a story as consistent with the story in Rufinus as possible. I mean, it's not an elephant in a room. This is just something we have to acknowledge, right? That once you have a story in a Greek or Roman source, then everything else there's this desperate effort to get everything to line up with it, right? Whereas if you look at it in its own terms, it might say something very different. So what are the other media that we have from Ezana? Like what media did he broadcast his religious affiliation, such as it were?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think your point is exactly right. That I mean, what's happened? I think it's very interesting how you put it. That you would never believe this story because this is the kind of the exact opposite of what's happened. That I mean, everybody's believed Rufinus, and it becomes kind of the framing for the entire thing. It's the entire story, and then scholars have just kind of come and put the Aksumite evidence interpreted it through Rufinus. And I think that we should go in exactly the opposite way. So what do we actually have from Ezana? So what we have that we have inscriptions and coins. So let's do inscriptions first. I just kind of think about from the religious viewpoint. So we have some inscriptions that have what are thought of as, so-called traditional pagan deities. So you have Beher and Meter. These are like the words for land and earth in Ge'ez. You have Ares, the Greek god, who's Mahram in the Ge'ez version of it. But we have Ashtar. So these kind of, traditional pagan deities. So, and this is one of these inscriptions that I have in mind. It's a bilingual tri-script. So it's in Greek, it's an Ethiopic language and Old South Arabian script, and it's an Ethiopic language and Ethiopic script. And Ezana says, I am the son of the invincible god Ares. And, and he talks about Ashtar. And so this is one. These are like the traditional pagan deities that are connected to the broader Red Sea world, I would say, and beyond. And then we have another set of inscriptions, and these are the ones I've already alluded to, that have the so-called monotheistic language in them. They talk about Lord of heaven, Lord of earth, Lord of the land, Lord of all. And this is kind of the second group of inscriptions. And then we have a third group of inscriptions that consist of exactly one. And this is a Greek inscription that begins with a clearly Trinitarian, overtly Trinitarian formula of, through the power, I think it's through the strength or power of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. It's, in your face, Trinitarian Christian formula. So we have these three types of inscriptions.
Can I jump in here for a second?
Yes, please.
I'd just like the audience to note the order in which you presented them, because this is important.
Yes, this will become important.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. And the order is extremely important. And then at the same time, we have coins that I'll present in the same order, that we have coins that have a disc and crescent, which is reminiscent of symbols that we find also jumping across the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula that correspond exactly to these kind of traditional pagan deities. The audience can't see, but always with scare quotes for me around traditional pagan deities. But we have disc and crescent. Then we have another group of coins that have no religious symbol at all. They're just entirely blank around the rim. And then we have a third set of coins that I've already mentioned by Ezana that have a cross. And so, as you've already pointed out, Anthony, what we have with these, I put them in this order because what scholars have tended to do is to read these things exactly together in this way and have this kind of linear progression where you have Ezana's inscriptions with the invincible god Ares and Ashtar, along with the disc and crescent. This would be the pagan period in scare quotes of Ezana. Then you get this intermediate period where you have Lord of heaven, Lord of earth, Lord of all, with no symbol on the coins. And then you finally come to a period where he begins an inscription in Greek by the power of the Father, a Trinitarian inscription, along with coins with crosses. And so, previous scholars would read them in this kind of linear order of, one step to the next.
Right, because the underlying narrative here is one of conversion, where you start as a pagan and you end up as a Christian. There's no way to date these materials absolutely or even relatively. So in a certain sense, that's an arbitrary sequence. And I just want to note that logically speaking, we can put them in the exact opposite sequence if we want. We can totally assume a scenario where Ezana's father had converted and kind of raised him as a Christian, but Ezana then goes back to his whatever ancestral traditions and abandons Christianity for whatever, which is exactly what happened in Bulgaria, for example, when Boris converts his son and heir then leads a, quote, pagan backlash. And then Simeon has to come in and restore Christianity, right? So these things, I don't know, it could be that way. So we're dealing
Exactly.
with
They're
tiny
purely a
scraps
scholarly order. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Purely a
yeah.
scholarly order. It's just purely a scholarly
Yeah.
construct. It could be right. It doesn't have to be right. This is just all scholarly contract. We can put these in any order we want. Yeah.
Yeah. So now we're dealing with sort of tiny scraps of evidence here, and there's so much that we don't know. No narrative accounts of Ezana really that would by people who knew him or anything like that. And so these bits have been assembled. They tell a story. Okay. Now, when you looked at these inscriptions and coins, you noticed look, a couple of curious things, and I'd like you to tell us about those, specifically the language when it comes to the inscriptions and the material when it comes to the coins. And you notice that these bits of evidence are not like all equivalent in certain important ways. So what are those?
Yeah, exactly. So when I started working on this material in depth, I started to see some, kinks in the armor as it goes. So I mentioned already this bilingual tri-script inscription. That's the kind of the classical example of Ezana's pagan period. The protection from the invincible god Ares. But as it turns out, if you read the Greek version, one of these Greek inscriptions has not only Lord and heaven, or of heaven and earth, but even Lord, Theos, of heaven and earth. And this, of course, is so reminiscent of the so-called monotheistic language. It's exactly the same language. So you have this, what is, should be the kind of pristine, perfect example of the pagan period. But when you read the Greek text, it's not. You have Lord of heaven and earth, which is exactly the monotheistic language. This isn't the only case. We have this Greek inscription that begins with the Trinitarian formula. That's on one side. On the other side of the stone, there's a Semitic language inscription. Unfortunately, the top is quite damaged, but it seems to be a war campaign against Nubia, exactly like the Greek text. Scholars, I'm not the first to suggest it, but a number of scholars take it to be the bilingual component to the Greek text. Mm-hmm. This is how I understand it. This one doesn't have a Trinitarian formula at all, but it has the monotheistic formulas, Lord of heaven. And so you have these two cases. We're dealing, it's only two cases, but we're dealing with very limited data where the scholarly construct really doesn't have room for this type of thing. It doesn't have any room for, having an inscription from the same period with the two different types of religious states of Ezana. And for me, it's quite interesting, of course, the languages that are at play, that it's in both cases, the Greek language inscriptions that would have what I would consider the more innovative theological language. So I want to come back to it in a minute. But with the coins, something else jumped out at me. And that is that if you look through all of Ezana's coins, we do have these three types of coins: the no religious symbol, the disc and crescent, and the crosses. But there's quite a difference in medium, and that is that the coins with crosses, Ezana only puts crosses on gold denominations of coins, with maybe a couple of exceptions that may actually not even exist. So, but by and large, these are gold denomination coins with crosses. And we have gold denomination coins of disc and crescent, but we don't have any lower denominations, so silver or base metal coins with crosses. And this is extremely interesting because of the distribution of coins that even based on fine spots and how these things work, but the gold denomination of coins circulate quite broadly. So all the way to India, hugely in South Arabia, and the silver and copper coins are mainly used for local currency. So for me, it seemed to correlate quite strongly with what I had seen in the inscriptions, that you find the most innovative religious language in the gold coins and in Greek. These just kind of correlate quite nicely. So Ezana's obviously doing kind of different things, in my view, depending on audience. So it's not only a question of chronology, but also a question of intended audience, whether it's Greek versus silver coins or Semitic language inscriptions versus, Greek inscriptions. Yeah.
Is on your reading and based on these observations, the sequence argument doesn't work. In other words, there aren't these discrete moments when he's flooding his media with a consistent message, but rather it's pretty clear. I mean, they were talking about like one stele, right? Or coins in different denominations that are synchronous, different messages. So what if instead of assembling them in a sequence, we kind of assume that a lot of these are contemporary. So what alternative picture does this suggest?
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm proposing is that this kind of we get rid of this intermediate period, the generic monotheist, and we get a kind of a different picture. So for me, I have kind of a before and an after, or an early and late period. So we have an early period of Ezana, where we have two different messages depending on audience, right? So we have the coins that have discant crescent. He presents himself kind of very traditional practices. And we have inscriptions in Semitic languages where he presents himself as, son of the invincible god Ares. But he opens a door, I think. And in this Greek version of this same time period, he opens the door with this language of Lord and heaven, Lord of heaven and earth. Then we have a second period for Ezana. I call it the later period. And here again, we have this kind of bifurcation. So we have material that is intended for kind of a Greco-Roman broader audience. We have the gold coins with crosses. We have a Greek inscription with a Trinitarian formula. But then to the local population, we have a quite different situation. And here I put the previous undifferentiated monotheistic. So we have kind of much more ambiguous language. We have Lord of heaven, Lord of earth, and we have coins with no religious symbols. And for me, this is a really interesting period, of course, because this is, it's of course not continuity, right? He's taken off the discant crescent. There's now nothing. He's done away with Ares. There's now Lord of heaven and earth. But for me, it's really interesting to think historically, what is he doing with this material? And it's just fascinating. But for me, he's really in a have your cake and eat it too moment. Yeah. So it's all ambiguous. So you can read these things in any direction. There's no religious symbol. They could be, forwards or backwards. I can teach you a little Ge'ez that these have Lord of heaven and earth. So it's Egzi Beher, Egzi Abher. And this is Lord of earth. And I wonder that if, for a kind of traditional pagan, can this just be another word for Beher? So I think it kind of be read backwards. This is just like what came before. Nothing new here. Don't worry. Nothing's changed. But for people who know Ge'ez, it's quite fascinating because Egziabher becomes the word for God, for theos or kurios in Ge'ez. So this is, for a Christian, this is just the Christian word for God. Mm-hmm. And it's, for me, it's really ambiguous, might go too far, but it's really these inscriptions that are intended to the local audience are really multivalent depending on who's reading them, just like the coins have no religious symbol.
It's fascinating to think that these different audiences might not have known what he was saying to the other audience.
Exactly. Please.
So why would a king like Ezana want to give these mixed messages?
Yeah, so this is where I think that for me this is where the real advantage of this type of approach of kind of setting aside, sidelining for a moment Rufinus and focusing on the Aksumite material, because we can kind of ask the question of why. Why is Ezana doing this? And I think it tells us then not only something about Ezana, but about what's going on in 4th century in Aksum. And so where Ezana was always kind of seen, this was always about kind of personal conviction. He met, Frumentius, and he converted, and there was never kind of any kind of real historical import.
Mhm.
But for here, we have to really think about what is Ezana doing. And for me, I wonder if he's not taking a page from Constantine's playbook here of he has a local population that he's dealing with. He has another population that he's dealing with. We have a very kind of fluid religious movement on the ground, and he's calibrating a message to different audiences in different ways. And the situation's moving, so he has to change. And that even when he's projecting himself as a Christian with coins, with crosses, and a Greek inscription with a Trinitarian formula, at the same time, with the local audience, I think he's really keeping the door open for both groups. He's trying to pacify as much of the local population as possible. That is, there's no reason to, exclude one constituency over the other if you can. Why not go with this ambiguous message in between and try to, split the difference? And I think that's exactly what he's up to.
Yeah, you mentioned Constantine, and so I think it's pretty clear that Constantine was, let me put it differently. I think it would have been fairly easy for most of Constantine's subjects to know that he favored Christianity in the church. Like he didn't really hide that very much, and his communications are internal and they're in the same languages. And I don't think anybody would have been confused by that. But he also emitted these mixed signals. And I'll give one example, which is kind of strikingly similar to what you're mentioning with Ezana, which is that at the very same time that he's delivering this sermon to a religious audience, we call this the Oration to the Saints. We don't know the exact occasion, but it's very Christian, and he's talking about how he's on the side of this, bishops, priests, whoever these people are, and he's bad-mouthing Apollo. In that speech, and at the very same moment, his designers who are building his city are putting his statue. The focal point of original Constantinople was the statue of Constantine, this colossal statue in the form of Constantine, which is a reworked Apollo. It is nude. He has rays coming out of his head. It's like straight up Apollo. Everybody knew it. And this made, of course, bishops like Eusebius very, very uncomfortable. They didn't know how to interpret this from an emperor who was telling them, no, I'm a Christian like you and I hate Apollo. And yet, to the majority of his subjects, because they're not attending that speech, they're seeing the statue. He's conveying very traditionalist messages.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think it's a wonderful parallel. So I think it's quite similar to what Ezana is doing. That for the local population, he's striking a balance, and it's a difficult balance. And of course, we can't lose sight that for both of these people, the situation's fluid on the ground. They have no idea which direction it ultimately goes. It's easy in retrospect to say, but for them at the time, they have no idea, and they have to wave in the wind a little bit and secure as many as large a constituency as possible without alienating as many people as possible, I think. And
so we do know what happened. So exactly. Does Aksum go full Christian after him?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's really interesting for those who have been working on the Horn of Africa and Christianity there, because the answer has always traditionally been that unlike most other places across the ancient world, Christianity in Aksum was top down. So if you buy this Rufinus narrative, you have a situation where Ezana converted to Christianity, and then the Christianity kind of slowly seeps down. Again, this is against all other kind of historical places that we really know about, or against the majority of them. But this has been the traditional narrative about Aksum forever, that Christianity, that Ezana converted and kind of traditionally understood, Ezana converted, but it didn't affect the local population all that much. And in fact, it took a so-called second Christianization later in the 5th and 6th centuries to really convert the local population. And many of us now have abandoned this second Christianization. My current project actually is exactly on this question of second Christianization. And I think that there's really little historical evidence for it. But if we get back to Ezana, what I'm proposing here is something very, very different, because now we don't have, if we sideline Rufinus and we look at these Aksumite sources, and if you buy this reconstruction, we have something totally different. We have a bottom up, a ground up conversion. So Ezana is weighing what's going on. You have, foreigners, outsiders who are using Greek. You have various elites, as problematic and vague as this term is, these local elites. But then you have this local population that part of them are already converting to Christianity, accepting Christianity, and that this is what Ezana is weighing. So if we're taking the temperature of the Christianity of Aksum in Ezana's time, in my reconstruction, it's much more Christian. The scales have already tipped in the balance of Christianity, and this is what Ezana is responding to. And so, so it does away with the need for this later second Christianization. And for me, I think we're much better off having a bottom-up view of, Christianization of Aksum, and Ezana's the test case. That now that he starts even to the local population, opening the door for Christianity means that the scales and the balance are already tipping in favor. And yes, that the population does become Christian quite quickly, I think. And in fact, is already well on the way.
Aaron, I really enjoyed this. It was such a meticulous reconstruction of the evidence or rather deconstruction of the narratives, and looking at the evidence very, very closely and carefully in a way that I had not seen done. So thank you for sending this to me. I was wondering if you had any final thoughts you wanted to leave the audience with, or maybe something about the significance of all of this, or where do we go from here? Or do you have any other projects that are kind of probing that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that people working on the Horn of Africa right now are kind of in a really new moment of rethinking what the history of what we have. That for a long time we've been bound to kind of quite traditional narratives, traditional scholarly narratives of how these things work. So the Ezana is a nice case of you have this Rufinus narrative, it's top down. Then you have this so-called second Christianization by Syriac Christians fleeing the Council of Chalcedon. You come to a dark period where you have the Zagwe dynasty, and then you have this new Solomonic, and it's every one of these pieces of the story are now starting to fall, I think. And I think that and I think really importantly, they're starting to fall by a reconsideration of the actual kind of local sources. That instead of looking at various other lenses, whether they're kind of horizontal, so Greco-Roman, in this case with Rufinus, Greco-Roman, or also quite importantly in this case vertical lenses. So if you're reading earlier Horn of Africa material through later interpretations, this is quite complicated and problematic. But when we take the sources at the moment that are local sources that are contemporaneous, we get a really different picture of the historical narrative of Ethiopia and Eritrea from late antiquity up through the medieval period. And there's really kind of a complete reconsideration of this history. And
one of the obstacles I expect that this reconsideration might face is, comes from national narratives that have long since been built on the figure of the heroic, king who converts. Because having a name creates this kind of agency and ties it to a national story. And I think it's one of these tropes. It's just a trope that people are just going to have to overcome. And I'm confident that over time, they will. After all, the narrative that you're proposing isn't, any less favorable to anyone's national history. Why does it always have to be a king who sort of dictates things from above, like some heroic conversion, like the way Constantine, presented his own when he's at dinner with Eusebius and is, let me tell you what happened before the Battle of the Million Bridge. But no. They're very different things that were happening on the ground. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, it's super interesting because some of these are national narratives, but I think interestingly in this field, not all of them are. So this second Christianization, it's a very complicated story. It's the one that I have a project right now called Beyond Influence, but that's dealing with the question. But a lot of it is a scholarly narrative that's been taken back over by the tradition itself.
Yeah,
That
yeah, yeah.
and so that if you actually go and look at the Ethiopic sources, I mean, there's not near as much about these Syriac monks fleeing and coming and reconverting or converting for the first time Ethiopia. This is really kind of a combination of medieval, like truly medieval hagiographies read against 20th century Western scholars who are making them into Syriac. And so it's really interesting that if you just consider the local sources, that it's not at all against the national narrative in some way. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done in this area of kind of fresh historiography with a critical lens.
That's an excellent place to bring this to a close, Aaron. Thank you so much for your work. And I can't stress enough just how important the whole Aksum Ethiopian tradition is for Christianity in Africa. It's like huge. And it's just wonderful that you can actually bring more light to by looking at the details. Man, the philological rigor, that's in the end what counts. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Take care.